Bienvenue à cette conférence Leaders internationaux Bell de la Chambre de commerce du Montréal Métropolitain. Je me présente, Michelle Yambias-Meunier, directrice Affaires corporatives et relations avec la communauté, et je serai ce soir votre maître de cérémonie. D'entrée de jeu, je vous demanderai de bien vouloir mettre vos téléphones cellulaires en mode silencieux. Je vous invite toutefois à commenter la conférence de ce soir sur Twitter en utilisant le mot-clic Obama CCMM. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier les partenaires qui ont rendu possible la réalisation de cet événement, à commencer par Bell, le commanditaire en titre de la série Leaders internationaux. Cet événement est présenté par CN et réalisé en association avec Evenco. Nous remercions également nos collaborateurs, Investissement Québec, Molson Coors, Osler Avocat, Pomerleau, Power Corporation du Canada et Tact Intelligence Conseil. Je tiens à vous informer que la conférence du président Obama sera suivie d'une période de discussion avec Madame Sophie Brochu, présidente et chef de la direction de Gaz Métro. J'ai maintenant le plaisir de vous présenter les invités de la table d'honneur. I would ask our guests to please stand up as their names are called, and I would ask participants to withhold their applause until the end of the presentation. Maire de Montréal et président de la communauté métropolitaine de Montréal, M. Denis Coderre. Président et chef de la direction Air Canada, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Kaline Rovinescu. Président et chef de la direction Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Michael Sabia. Vice-président du Conseil RBC Gestion de patrimoine, M. Tony Lofreda. Présidente fondatrice, la gouvernance au féminin, Mme Caroline Coty. Président et chef de la direction, Club de hockey canadien et Evenco, et président du Conseil Molson Coors Brewing Company, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Geoffrey Eric Molson. Président et chef de la direction Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Emilio Imbriglio. Présidente, directrice générale de l'administration portuaire de Montréal et présidente du Conseil Cargo M, Mme Sylvie Vachon. Recteur, Université de Montréal et président U15, regroupement des universités de recherche du Canada, Dr Guy Breton. Écrivaine, Mme Kim Thuy. Cofondateur et directeur général pour 3 points, M. Fabrice Ville. Recteur et vice-chancelier, Université Concordia, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Alan Shepard. Directrice générale et conservatrice en chef du Musée des beaux-arts de Montréal et vice-présidente du Conseil des arts du Canada, Mme Nathalie Bondil. Associé, Tact Intelligence Conseil, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Frédéric Véraud. Actrice, réalisatrice, présidente, fondatrice du Festival de films Black, Montréal, Toronto et Halifax et Fondation Fabienne Collat, Madame Fabienne Collat. Consul General of the United States in Montreal, Mrs. Nia Maria Fight. Premier vice-président, infrastructure, caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec et président et chef de la direction CDPQ Infra, Monsieur Maquital. Fondatrice, présidente du Conseil et chef de la direction Centre d'innovation de Montréal et présidente du Conseil HEC Montréal, Mme Hélène Desmarais. Directrice générale stratégie de marque Google Canada et directrice générale Google Québec, grand partenaire de la Chambre, Mme Marie-Josée Lamotte. Corporatif et chef de la direction des affaires juridiques, CN, grand partenaire de la Chambre, M. Sean Finn. Ministre des Transports du Canada, l'honorable Marc Garneau. Président du Conseil, groupe Conseil Respublica, M. Andrew Molson. Ministre du Patrimoine canadien, l'honorable Mélanie Joly. Executive Chairman Claridge, Mr. Stephen Bronfman. Ministre des Relations internationales et de la francophonie, ministre responsable de la région des Laurentides et députée de l'Acadie, Mme Christine Saint-Pierre. Associé directeur, Montréal, Osler, Hoskin et Harcourt, grand partenaire platine de la Chambre, M. Shahir Guindi. Présidente du Conseil de la Société des célébrations du 375e anniversaire de Montréal, Mme France Chrétien Desmarais. President and Chief Executive Officer, Business Development Bank of Canada, Major Partner of the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Michael Denham. Présidente du Conseil Investissement Québec et présidente de l'Alliance coopérative internationale, Madame Monique Leroux. Président et chef de la direction du Fonds de solidarité FTQ, grand partenaire de la Chambre, Monsieur Gaétan Morin. President UB Media, Major Partner of the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Mike. Cofondatrice et coprésidente du groupe Germain Hospitalité, Madame Christiane Germain. Présidente et chef de la direction Gaz Métro, grand partenaire de la Chambre, Madame Sophie Brochu. Première vice-présidente à la direction particulier et entreprise de la Banque nationale, grand partenaire platine de la Chambre, Madame Diane Giard. Vice-présidente exécutive Québec-Bell, grand partenaire platine de la Chambre et présidente sortante du Conseil de la Chambre, Madame Martine Turcotte, qui prendra place sous peu. Présidente, Réseau des entrepreneurs et professionnels africains, Madame Gracia Kasuki-Katawa. Président, BMO Groupe financier Québec, grand partenaire de la Chambre et président du Conseil de Montréal International, Monsieur Jacques Ménard. Ministre de l'Économie, de la Science et de l'Innovation, ministre responsable de la stratégie numérique et député de Saint-Henri-Sainte-Anne, Madame Dominique Anglade. Président directeur général Pomerleau, grand partenaire de la Chambre et président du Conseil de la Chambre, Monsieur Pierre Pomerleau. Premier ministre du Québec, Monsieur Philippe Couillard. Et le président et chef de la direction de la Chambre de commerce du Montréal Métropolitain, Monsieur Michel Leblanc, qui prendra place sous peu. Mesdames et messieurs, votre table d'honneur. J'inviterai maintenant Madame Martine Turcotte, vice-présidente exécutive Québec-Bell, à venir vous dire quelques mots. Madame Turcotte.
Mr. President Barack Obama, Monsieur le Premier ministre du Québec, Philippe Couillard, distingués invités à la table d'honneur, Mesdames et Messieurs, Ladies and Gentlemen, bonsoir. Alors, bienvenue à cet événement de la Chambre de commerce du Montréal Métropolitain qui s'inscrit dans le cadre de la série Leaders internationaux Bell. Et je vais vous dire, on est très fiers chez Bell de s'associer à cette belle série qui existe depuis tous ses débuts. Ces conférences permettent à la fois à la communauté d'affaires, mais aussi au grand public, comme on le voit ici ce soir, de rencontrer des personnalités d'action, des personnalités qui ont un impact sur notre univers économique, social et politique. La présence du président Obama ce soir est un moment marquant de cette série. Et j'aimerais en profiter pour féliciter chaleureusement la Chambre de commerce qui a cru vraiment avec conviction à la célèbre phrase, et vous la connaissez cette phrase-là, « Yes, we can ». Alors, oui. Alors, je peux vous dire que l'équipe de la Chambre a travaillé très, très fort pour attirer ici, à Montréal, un des leaders les plus charismatiques et rassembleurs de la scène mondiale. Et en tant que chef de file du secteur des communications au Québec, Bell est heureuse de favoriser les échanges avec des leaders remarquables dans le cadre de cette série-là. Et cette association prend ce soir un sens tout spécial puisque nous faisons affaire avec un communicateur qui est hors pair. President Obama, a very warm welcome to you, to our beautiful city of Montreal. We are very privileged to have you with us tonight, especially as we celebrate this year our city's 375th anniversary. Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, bonne conférence. Merci.
Merci, Madame Turcotte. Alors, j'inviterai maintenant Monsieur Michel Leblanc, le président et chef de la direction de la Chambre de commerce du Montréal Métropolitain, à venir vous présenter votre conférencier. Monsieur Leblanc.
President Obama, Premier ministre Couillard, distingués invités, Montréalais, Québécois, Canadiens, bienvenue, bonsoir. Quel moment exceptionnel. C'est un honneur pour la Chambre d'accueillir le président Obama, l'un des leaders les plus inspirants du début du 21e siècle. C'est un privilège pour nous tous d'avoir la chance ce soir de l'écouter, présenter sa vision des enjeux qui nous touchent tous. Pour ceux qui l'ignorent, à ce moment-ci, nous sommes en diffusion directe, en transmission directe sur 4 chaînes de télévision canadiennes et sur CNN National aux États-Unis. Cet événement-là va donner lieu ce soir à des analyses sur tous les bulletins de nouvelles de la planète et ça va être « Today, President Obama was giving a speech in Montreal in Canada ». President Obama, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation to speak to our community. It's an honor to welcome you in Montreal. It means a lot for Montrealers and Canadians. Mr. Obama, you were elected on a platform that was a call for hope. Yes, we can, did you say at the time? And in this community, we believed in that motto, yes, we can, yes, we could. And together, we worked very hard in developing this economy, developing this country. During your tenure as president, you had many accomplishments. I'll just talk about 4 of them that inspired us. First, let's all recognize that you successfully led the recovery of the U.S. out of the Great Recession. It was in itself a major accomplishment. I'll just mention, because it's important for us, when you left office, you had 75 straight months of job creation. We envy that. Now, second, you transformed your country by delivering on a promise that many before you made to the country, to the United States, which was medical insurance for all. Now, from a Canadian standpoint, clearly it made perfect sense. Another achievement, you worked hard with Canada and 10 other nations to create a free trade area spanning from Chile to Japan, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And may I say, here in Montreal, you are amongst the most convinced to free trade. We're certain that the world will eventually embrace your visions of a TPP, be it a TPP 2.0. And finally, your leadership on climate change and negotiations with China meant to protect our planet, the Paris Climate Agreement. May I say that last week we stood stunned by the withdrawal of the U.S. from the agreement. But I can tell you that in this business community and as Canadians, we will pursue our effort to combat climate change, and we're committed to implement the Paris Agreement, which you work so hard to deliver. Mr. President, your achievement in office have made you one of the most transformative, inspirational leaders of the beginning of the 21st century. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is with an immense honor that I invite on this podium the most influential voice of progress in the world, the 44th President of the United States of America, Barack Obama.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please have a seat. Thank you. Bonsoir. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that generous introduction. I have to point out that one of the things I love about Montreal is there's a high percentage of Michelles here. I've met a number of them so far. I want to thank all of you for having me this evening. Premier Couillard, ministers, Mayor Kodire, and somebody who I've been very proud to see serve as America's ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, who is here. So I know I'm going to have an opportunity for questions and answers, but I want to give a few remarks at the top. Let me first of all say that I was always very proud as president to highlight the extraordinary alliance and friendship between Canadians and Americans. Canada was the first country I visited after I took office. Last year, Michelle and I were delighted to host our friends Justin and Sophie for their first official visit and state dinner with Canada in the United States in nearly 20 years. And I had the great privilege of addressing the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. Most importantly, my brother-in-law is Canadian, from Burlington, just outside of Toronto, and he is a great brother-in-law and father of two extraordinary nieces of mine. So my bonds with Canada are deep. But this is my first visit to Montreal. So, merci beaucoup. And what a time to visit. I understand this is a full summer of celebrations for your 375th birthday, so bon anniversaire. My French accent is terrible, but it's heartfelt. The good wishes to this extraordinary world-class city. And I look forward to sitting with Sophie and taking some questions. Let me first just make a few observations on the world today. It's been clear for some time that the world is at an inflection point. From a city like this, we can look upon the world that has benefited enormously from the international order that the United States and Canada and other allies helped to build together in the wake of World War II. But we can see that that same order is increasingly strained by the accelerating forces of change. The unrelenting pace of globalization, the breathtaking pace of technological change. These shifts have shaken the foundations of individual families and our communities and our collective politics, and that has happened in both developed and developing countries. So the challenges of our time, whether it's economic inequality, climate change, terrorism, mass migration, these are real challenges. The world is more prosperous than ever before, but alongside that prosperity, we've also seen a rise in inequality and wage stagnation across many advanced economies, leaving too many workers and communities fearful of diminishing prospects, not just for themselves, but more importantly, for their children. The world is, by most measures, less violent than ever before, but it remains riven by old divisions and fresh hatreds. The world is more connected than ever before, but even as the internet has the capability of spreading knowledge and the possibility of greater understanding between peoples and cultures, it also empowers terrorists to spread hatred and violence. Like everyone else, I was horrified by the recent attacks in London over the weekend. I offer my deepest condolences to all the people of the United Kingdom. And like the other attacks that we've seen in Manchester, in Paris, in Brussels, in Berlin, this was not an attack on a military target. It was an attack on ordinary people gathering in a public space. And as such, it was an attack on free and open societies and on the spirit of democracy itself. Now, I'm convinced that ISIL will ultimately be destroyed. And I know this not only because of the power of our militaries and the sophisticated efforts of our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, but because I know the character of our peoples. And you could see it in the way that the people of London and the people of Manchester before them and the people of Berlin and Paris have responded with resolve, not with blame, not with division, but with a willingness to help people who are in need. And in doing so, they've set an example for all of us. That is why we will prevail, because our way of life is stronger if we work for that better future, if we maintain faith in the values that has brought us so far. Terrorism will not be defeated overnight, and the pace of change, the disruptions that are happening globally, are only going to accelerate. And what's more, in an age of instant information, where TV and Twitter can feed us a steady stream of bad news, and sometimes fake news, it can seem like the international order that we've created is being constantly tested and that the center may not hold. And in some cases, that leads people to search for certainty and control, and they can call for isolationism or nationalism, or they can suggest rolling back the rights of others, or simply they can try to retreat and suggest that we have no obligations beyond our borders or beyond our communities, beyond our tribe, that what's good for me and my immediate people is all that matters. Everybody else is on their own. You know, those instincts of retrenchment are understandable. They're tempting during changing times. In periods like this, people looking for control and certainty, it's inevitable. And it's inevitable that our social arrangements and our politics will be disrupted. But it is important to remember that the world has gone through similar moments in the shift from, for example, agriculture to industry. And then, too, there was a temptation to respond to great uncertainty and economic upheaval by falling into the comforts of tribe and extreme nationalism and xenophobia and the politics of us versus them. And the First and Second World Wars showed us all too terribly what happens when we fail to adapt to these changes. But our history also shows that there's a better way. Canada shows, the United States, Europe, Japan, shows that it is possible for us to overcome our fears and to reach across our divides and to think anew and act anew and emerge stronger than before. That's what we did after World War II. In creating an international order that was based not just on self-interest but also on principles. And the United States and Canada helped to lead that effort, cooperating to make the world safer and more secure and a more just and prosperous place. We are not only bound by the service of those who defended us from Flanders Field to the beaches of Normandy 73 years ago, not just in the skies of the Balkans or the mountains of Afghanistan or the training bases of Iraq, we're also bound by the institutions that we built to keep the peace. A United Nations to advance our collective aspirations, a NATO alliance to ensure our security, a vast web of commerce that carries goods from one end of this continent to the other, across the longest border of peace on earth. And our history together, our efforts together, speak to a common set of values. The values of pluralism and tolerance and openness and the rule of law. A liberal market-based order that places primacy on individual rights, freedom of speech and press and religion and assembly. A commitment to the dignity and human rights of all people. Those are the values that we built, not always perfectly, sometimes hypocritically, but steadily over the course of 70 years. And just in my lifetime, this international order did more than just prevent a third world war. It's responsible for helping to grow the global average life expectancy by about 2 decades. It's responsible for cutting extreme poverty in half. It helped make it possible for women to vote in every democracy, and the freedom to marry who you love to become a reality in a growing number of nations. Although racial and religious discrimination remain a stubborn part of most societies, they're no longer accepted as right or just. And our next generation, my children and yours, they embrace diversity like never before. Our freedom, our quality of life here in the West, in Canada, in the United States, remains the envy of the world. So much so that families are willing to walk across deserts and cross seas on makeshift rafts and risk everything just for the chance that their children might enjoy the blessings that we enjoy, take for granted. That's what was built after World War II, based on not just power, but on principle. And that's, if you had to choose one moment in history in which you could be born and you didn't know ahead of time who you were going to be, what nationality, what gender, what race, whether you were born into nobility or a peasant, you'd choose right now. It's an extraordinary time, but so often we take it for granted. And at times of disruption, we may go backward instead of forward. The extraordinary progress we made over the decades should give us confidence, but it should not feed complacency. And complacency is not the character of great nations. Today's threats, in fact, are not as stark as the ones in the last century. But the struggle for freedom and security and human dignity, the necessity to constantly work to make our democracies function effectively, to ensure that prosperity is widely spread and widely shared rather than just enjoyed by the few, that work goes on. And if we are going to uphold those principles, that architecture that was built, that we have all benefited from, then we're going to have to summon the same capacity to adapt to new circumstances that we saw after World War II. We're going to have to meet changing times while at the same time upholding timeless ideals. And we're going to have to replace fear with hope. That's the spirit that we need right now. Because if we begin to doubt ourselves, if democracies begin to doubt themselves and all that we've accomplished, if we begin to question the very real gains that have been made over the last several decades, and we violate our principles because of fear and uncertainty, then we can't expect the progress that is just now taking hold in many places around the world to continue. And instead, we are going to be inviting in those who argue that democracy doesn't work, that restrictions on the press are necessary, and that intolerance and tribalism and organizing ourselves along ethnic lines are the answer to today's challenges. And we see those voices around the world. Now, part of the reason that there's been so much uncertainty is we went through an enormous crisis just as I was coming into office. But consider what we've done over the past decade. Canada, the United States, and like-minded nations. We wrestled the global economy from the brink of a depression and put the world back on the path to recovery. We helped stop Ebola in West Africa, saving countless lives. We rallied the world around new sustainable development goals, including our goal to end extreme poverty. In Paris, we came together around the most ambitious agreement in history to fight climate change. An agreement that, even with the temporary absence of American leadership, will still give our children a fighting chance. None of these achievements would have happened if the United States had acted alone. It happened because we had strong partnerships with nations like Canada, because we had shared values, and we acted on those values. And when we lead with our hopes and not our fears, we are capable of doing things that other nations cannot or will not do. So at this time, we cannot stand still. We have to act with greater urgency and greater conviction. And we have to acknowledge that there are very real problems that exist in our world today. We have to acknowledge that there are forces that sometimes make our people feel like they are powerless in the face of change. We have to adapt to new circumstances. We should not be paralyzed by the challenges we face, but it should spur us to action. Because we've always had the capacity to rebuild our social arrangements and remake our politics and adapt to dizzying changes that take place. And that's the work that we're called on to do today. And we're going to have to do it together. And I'll just offer a couple of quick thoughts about areas that we're going to have to work on together. First, we're going to have to make sure that a high-tech economy works for everybody and not just for a few. Capitalism and open markets have been the greatest generator of wealth in human history. They have raised standards of living around the globe. But globalization and the relentless pace of automation have also weakened the position of workers and their ability to secure decent wages. We know that economies don't work as well or grow as fast when just a few prosper at the expense of a growing middle class. If there are not enough ladders of opportunity, it destabilizes rather than strengthens the economy. This chamber understands this. Montreal understands it. And we have to recognize that economies that are increasingly unequal will pose challenges to our liberal international order, have the ability to strangle the goose that's laying all those golden eggs. When the top 1% amass a bigger and bigger and bigger share of wealth and income, the concern among many in our countries is that the game is fixed against them, that their governments are serving the interests just of the powerful. And it doesn't help when sometimes those who benefit most from globalization appear to use their political power to further undermine the position of workers. That's a recipe for more cynicism and more polarization, less trust in our institutions and less trust in each other. And it's part of what leads people to turn to populist alternatives that may not actually deliver, but are tempting. Now, I believe that we cannot unwind integration. I don't think we can pull up a drawbridge. I don't think we can stuff technology back in the box. We can't reverse progress. We have to build new social compacts to make progress work for everyone, to guarantee all of our young people the education they need, to give workers the power to organize for better wages, to reform our tax codes so that those who reap the most from the new economy can't avoid their obligations to the countries that made their success possible. We have to invest in the skills and the education and the capacity of our people and their ability to take an idea and turn it into a business. We have to modernize the social safety nets that empower them to take those risks. And just as we work to alleviate inequality within our own economies, I believe that we still need to do more to close the gap between rich and poor nations. Making sure that fragile states do not collapse in the first place, helping emerging economies become markets for our goods, it's not just charity, it's the smart thing to do, and ultimately will be good for businesses here in Canada and the United States. Second, when it comes to the threat of climate change, we have shown that environmental sustainability and economic progress are not contradictory, but rather are complementary. In the United States, under my administration, we doubled production of renewable energy at the same time as we saw a record duration of job creation. And I took great comfort last week in seeing American states and cities and universities and corporations that made it clear they will keep pushing forward for the sake of future generations. And working in concert with other nations, we're going to begin the process of lowering our carbon emissions enough to buy the next generation some time to create the next clean energy breakthroughs. But we're all going to have to work hard to make sure that happens with great determination and great conviction. Number 3, we have to recognize that on the world stage, our biggest threat is not necessarily great power contests that we saw in the 20th century, but rather failed states, rogue states, terrorism, disaffection in places like the Middle East. So we have to sustain our alliances. We have to help other countries with their own development. And we have to couple our extraordinary military strength with the power of our economies and our ideals and our investments and our know-how, because if we can shrink the circles of despair and fear and build a landscape of hope, that ultimately is the best security policy we can come up with. 4th, we're going to have to recognize that there will be a balance between our laws and traditions of openness to immigrants and refugees. That's fundamental to who we are. You look around Montreal, you look at my hometown of Chicago, that's who we are. And recognize that we can do it in an orderly way. You know, if our people feel that immigration is disorderly, then we put at risk our ability to welcome immigrants because we see so oftentimes political backlash. And so it's important for us to establish processes to make sure that we reaffirm that we are nations of immigrants, that it creates dynamism in our economies, strengthens rather than weakens us, and do so in a way that also upholds our tradition of lawfulness. You've done a good job of that in Canada, and you should be. And finally, we have to recognize how technology is changing the way in which people are receiving information. We are more connected than ever before. It also makes it easier, ironically, for us to just find people who only agree with us, to surround ourselves virtually by those who will never challenge our assumptions. We're seeing a splintering where we don't just have disagreements based on our opinions, but now people are just disagreeing on facts. And we're in an environment where we are only accepting information that fits our opinions, rather than basing our opinions on the facts that we receive, and evidence, and reason, and logic. And so we're going to need to by the way, that too has been part of the architecture of our prosperity, is the Enlightenment, and we should continue to promote those values. We're going to have to find a way to push back on propaganda and cultivate independent journalism and listen to those with whom we disagree and work hard to find common ground. And that's especially true for those of us who've had the privilege to serve in elected office. Our countries are not comparable. I know that sometimes there are a lot of Canadians in America, so sometimes you surprise us. You sneak up on us. But there are obvious differences. In America, we see more the corrosive influence of money in our politics. The entrenched partisanship, the low voting rates, in part because of a patchwork of laws that makes it harder to vote. These are all flaws in our democracy that have to be addressed. But around the world, decision makers have to remember that democracy needs to be driven by civic engagement from the bottom up and not just governance by experts from the top down. And these are real problems. And by the way, it is a problem that oftentimes plagues politicians on the left just as much as politicians on the right. Those of us who lead democratic governments and who are making the case, as we should, for democracy abroad, have to strive to set a good example at home. Because if our citizens' expectations are not met, and they believe they have no control over the decisions that are made by distant bureaucrats or dysfunctional government, then they will try anything. And they'll turn to populist or nationalist or even authoritarian movements. The bottom line is democracy is hard, and progress does not always move in a straight line. And its gains are often fragile if we as citizens are not tilling the soil and maintaining that democracy. But having said that, the good news is I am convinced that the future does not belong to strong men. I believe deeply that the liberal international order, based not just on military power or national affiliations, but on principles, on rule of law, on human rights, on individual freedoms, on empathy, on understanding across cultures, that's our only choice. That's what's brought us this far. That's what's promoted economic opportunity. That's what's prevented another world war. That's what's lifted millions of people out of poverty around the globe. So those of us who believe in those values and believe in democracy, we have to speak out with conviction. We have to listen. We have to acknowledge imperfect information. We don't have a monopoly on wisdom, but we have to speak on behalf of those things that we know are true and are right, because both the facts and history, I believe, are on our side. It doesn't mean democracies are not without flaws. It doesn't mean that the cure of what ails our democracies is easy, but it does mean that the cure involves greater engagement by our citizens, not less. And that's why the focus for the rest of my time on this earth, in addition to enjoying my children and in a distant future grandchildren, will be active citizenship in the United States and around the world. The Obama Foundation will be based in Chicago, but we're going to have projects and programs and partnerships and digital networks all over the world. And there will be partnerships with local organizations who are already doing great work in their communities. And our focus is going to be on creating space for a wide range of diverse participants to come together and be involved and be engaged, and to solve local problems and train the next generation of citizens and leaders on the global stage as well. And I'm looking forward to working with counterparts in Canada on this generational project, because I believe that the future is on our side, and I believe there's not a challenge on the planet that Americans and Canadians can't figure out if we're working together. If we stand up for our values and our ideals, and we are bringing that next generation of leaders to the fores, and we're going to carry on the proud legacy and the extraordinary work that's been done by our fathers and mothers and previous generations. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, bonsoir.
Thank you.
As you can see, you have many, many friends in Montreal. And as you know, Mr. President, yes, you have many friends in Montreal. As you know, oftentimes, discussions with former political leaders are explorations of their past. But tonight, we will do it differently. Tonight, my questions will focus on the future because, sir, we are in dire need of your insights, of your vision, and of your inspiration. My first line of question will piggyback upon a theme of your speech, and it's about economic justice. And you said it, in a growing number of countries around the world, there is increasing disparities between poor people and rich people. So much so that a lot of people across the planet feel left out, deprived of the opportunities, and abandoned by the government. And now we have a tsunami of growing automation coming at us that will take over high-paid jobs, high-skilled jobs, with the threat of seeing even more people losing hope into their own destiny. Mr. President, how can we help? What role do you see for business communities like ours in crafting the new societal framework you talked about so that people know that they will be able to cope with disruption and hope for a brighter future?
Well, it's a great question, and I touched on some of these issues in my opening remarks. Look, let me reaffirm that I believe that our market-based systems are the greatest mechanism to allocate resources and to improve standard of living. And it has been tested by history and tested by time. It works. And if you think about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, as those of us who were privileged enough to be born in advanced economies, our parents, our grandparents saw steadily rising standards of living, in part because you didn't have as much global competition. You had a big chunk of the world that was behind the Iron Curtain. You had countries like China and India that were trying socialist or communist control economy approaches that were failing, and that left the international markets to our businesses, and we showed and led the way in terms of productivity, efficiency, innovation. And now, I think it's well established around the world that a market-based system makes sense. But what we have also seen, I think, over the last 2 decades is that the advent of globalization and technology can continue to produce great wealth, but it can also skew how distribution of that wealth takes place, both between nations and within nations. We've also seen, I think, more companies become global companies rather than local companies. And so the investment that they feel in any particular local community, I think, sometimes has changed. And as a consequence, in what some have called a winner-take-all economy, more and more wealth accrues to those who have access to a global market, are making the very best products, and you need less and less people to make those products. And as a consequence, not only does it become harder for those in poverty in advanced economies to improve their standing, they feel as if the ladders for advancement have been reduced, but the middle class itself also gets squeezed because a lot of solid middle class jobs, not just blue collar jobs, but also white collar jobs, now are being replaced by AI, robots, and so forth. Now, the good news is I think that if we make some adjustments to our social structure so that the social safety net is accommodating these changes, so that we are investing more in the service side of the economy, which is going to be employing a larger and larger percentage of people, that we can actually manage this transition just as we did the previous transition. But it's going to require us making a greater investment in education so that every child has the ability to navigate a knowledge-based economy. It's going to require, I think, rethinking the service sector economy so that teachers, for example, are paid more than they are for very difficult work, or those who are in the helping professions in healthcare as the population ages, that they are able to have a decent living. Canada has already made some of these improvements a long time ago, like making sure that you have health care for everyone and a pension system that is secure, so that as people have to shift jobs a lot during the course of their lifetime because the economy is so dynamic, that they don't feel as if the bottom completely falls out from under them. Those are efforts that we're still working on in the United States of America. We made some progress, not as much as I would like. And I think that we're going to have to also think about how do we promote intelligent development in some of the poorest countries in the world, so that we are expanding those markets and we don't see more and more countries collapse because their economies don't feed their people or they cannot function. Now, when it comes to international development, I think that that's going to mean not just aid, but trade. It's going to mean asking those countries to improve rule of law, to fight against corruption. There has to be accountability in terms of how we work those aid programs, but I think that we can't ignore them. We can't pretend somehow that if 1 billion people or 2 billion people are desperate around the world, that's not going to be putting strains on the entire global system over the long term. But the good news is that I have confidence in our ability to do this. What's lacking right now is political will and vision. And if we cut ourselves off, if those of us who've done very well in this winner-take-all economy decide that we don't have to worry about poor people in our country, if wealthier nations decide that we don't have to worry about poorer countries, then I think the stability of the overall system will collapse over time. And it may happen in fits and starts, but eventually everybody will be poor. Everybody will be affected. And you know, I think the role of enlightened businesses, like those represented here, will be absolutely critical in promoting the kind of balanced, smart growth, both domestically and internationally, that we can sustain over a long period of time.
Let's move to environment. Mm-hmm. Under your presidency, you made some bold move to create the foundations for a clean economy in the USA.
Right.
You were at the center of the Paris Agreement negotiations. I was in Paris at the time, and I saw, like everybody, that you were the champion of a planet-wide solution. And under your leadership, China and United States, you came together in forging an historical commitment to reduce carbon pollution. Now, when I look south of the Canadian border these days, the journey toward a greener future looks more like the game of snakes and ladders, with more snakes and less ladders. That said, we saw the White House walking away from the Paris Agreement, de facto creating a huge leadership vacuum. Mr. President, do you believe that China is going to become the next environmental leader of the world?
Well, look, I am hugely invested in dealing with climate change because, as I said, I've got daughters. At some point, I'm going to have grandchildren. And this won't likely affect me as much as it will affect them. And this is a generational challenge. And if we don't act now, then it is going to be that much more difficult for the next generation to deal with a warming planet. The good news is that even before we signed the Paris Agreement, we had already seen some of the efforts that had been taking place in the United States and in other countries making an enormous difference in changing the economics of clean energy. So when I came into office, the solar and the wind industry was on the verge of collapse, in part because they were just at that point getting started, had made some significant capital investments based on certain tax policies and certain economic assumptions, and they were on the edge of not making it. We made a big infusion into that industry. We changed some of our regulatory structures. And over the course of my administration, while growing the economy and adding jobs at a record duration, we saw wind power increase threefold. We saw solar power increase tenfold. And most importantly, the cost of clean energy became comparable to the cost of old dirty energy. Now, there's still some challenges technologically in terms of storage, but it has changed the economics of investment in the energy market. And so part of the reason we were able to get the Paris Agreement done is I could credibly say to Prime Minister Modi of India that if you invest now in solar energy, you can leapfrog the old technologies and continue to grow the economy and provide electricity for hundreds of millions of people, while at the same time being part of a compact that starts bringing down our carbon emissions. And the reason that's so important to emphasize is that obviously I'm disappointed with the current American administration's decision to pull out of Paris, but all that work that we did is now embedded in decisions that are being made by companies all around America and all around the world. So it's not as if Walmart is now going to suddenly reverse itself. They're going to continue to build on the clean energy that they've already invested in because it turns out it saves them money and it's good for their bottom line. And a whole slew of Fortune 500 companies who are massive energy users are going to continue to see the need to invest in the future and build their business models based on where we're going, not where we've been. That gives me confidence, and as I mentioned, you're seeing states like California that will continue to build on the progress that we've already made. When it comes to selling cars, because obviously the United States and Canada are partners, in a lot of the automotive industry. If you want to sell cars in California, you're still going to have to look at those emission standards that we set, even if they're not being as rigorously promoted by the current administration. And so, it's one of the benefits of capitalism when it's working well, is it sends some good price signals out there. And I actually think that for many of you who are currently in business, if you look at the economics of it, you're going to conclude it makes sense for us to do the right thing. And those millions of decisions that are being made all around the world gives us hope. It continues to give us a chance. But we're going to have to act with more urgency, and I'm looking forward to the United States being a leader and not just on the sidelines on this issue going forward.
On the same topic of environment, if I could use an image, I would say everybody wants to go to paradise, nobody wants to die. So the vast majority of people embrace the idea of a greener economy. But the reality is also the fact that the people who will get the green jobs, the future jobs, are not necessarily the people who are working in the old energy industries. So if we were able to convince and to calm them, to bring these people on board, we would go a longer way in moving forwards. Do you think our governments are doing enough to talk to the men and women who work in the oil fields and in the industries of yesterday, to calm their fear and to make sure that they will see through the ability to bring bread on their table today for their children? Because these people will play as an important role as the people who will get the greener job, right? Are we doing enough for them?
Well, I think that I don't want to speak for the Canadian government. I haven't examined closely what they're doing on this front. I think there's no doubt that under my administration we did some of this, but not enough. And look, in any changing economy, the challenge that you be occurring in all kinds of sectors. So if you are a man my age who has worked all his life in a manufacturing industry that is now undergoing rapid change, whether it's because of robotics or AI or because the market has changed for coal, that's going to be a scary thing. And retraining midlife for new jobs is difficult. And there's oftentimes going to be a geographical mismatch. And there is no doubt that if we are neglectful, if we ignore the legitimate concerns of those individuals, then their anxieties are going to express themselves politically, and that can serve as a backlash against environmental efforts. This is where, though, the issue of information is important, because and facts and news. If you look at the coal industry, for example, my home state of Illinois, we had a coal industry in southern Illinois, and there is no doubt that some of those communities that were reliant on coal mining have suffered from tough times. Jobs have shrunk. The fact is, the main reason that those jobs went away is because natural gas was so much cheaper than coal. It was not because of the heavy hand of regulation. Part of it was a response to market forces. But that's not the information that was being provided to those individuals. All they saw is they're losing their jobs, and it was easy sometimes to demagogue those job losses. For all the jobs that were lost in coal, many multiples of jobs were gained in the solar industry. But those didn't get advertised and didn't get lifted up. And in fact, if you are skilled at mining coal, it's a lot easier to install a solar panel on a roof. And those are good jobs for which people could be retrained. I pushed Congress to try to get more money into that. We did not always get the kind of cooperation we wanted, in part because politically convenient to say that this was because of Paris or environmental regulations, that people were losing their jobs. It served political interests rather than serving the people who really needed help. But I think a good principle generally for all progressives who want a clean energy future or want to ensure that we're responsive to the needs of refugees or whatever the issue may be, is to pay attention and to listen to those who may be affected in ways that those of us in cities like Montreal or New York or Chicago may not always feel, may feel insulated from. But it's also important for us to, I think, challenge false narratives and false news that leads people to believe that reactionary policies are somehow going to be responsive to those folks. And this is why politics is so important and civic engagement is so important, because the stories we tell each other about how the very real challenges we face and fears that we have can be addressed, you know, that's going to matter as much as any technical solutions that we may have. And I think it's very important for us to have the kinds of narratives that bring people together, that share burdens as well as opportunities, rather than have a narrative that says those people are bad and we're the ones who have a monopoly on wisdom.
Mr. President, let's move to geopolitics, if we may.
Okay.
In 20-odd years from now, 80% of the population of the world will be living in Asia and in Africa. So what does that mean down the road for the geopolitical relevance of USA and Canada? Because as we know, also the expected economical growth for the next 10 years, half of it will come from those geographies. And we know, we look at China, economic power entails geopolitical power. So what does it mean? How will we keep our relevance down the road? How will we keep a positive influence?
Well, look, I'm somebody, let's take China as an example. I'm somebody who has always believed that it is good for the world that China has advanced and that their economy has done well, because millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in China. And those children in China who now are less likely to suffer from famine, who are more likely to get an education, who have access to electricity or medicine, that is a good thing. We should welcome that. It's not a zero-sum game for China to succeed. Now, there are times where the Chinese government acts in ways that are entirely self-interested to our detriment, and I think we have to be very firm with them if they're manipulating currencies or they're not protecting intellectual property for U.S. companies or Canadian companies that are investing in China, or not providing access to their markets while expecting access to ours. You know, those are legitimate sources of tension, but generally speaking, we should feel that a stable, steadily growing China is good for the world order, so long as China is willing to bear the burdens of that international order. The same is true for India, the same is true for the countries in Africa. What the United States and Canada and Western Europe in the past offered was a set of ideas. And those ideas continue to be relevant. And we underwrote much of the growth that took place in China, or the progress that took place in other parts of the world, because we established trading systems and things that we take for granted, like being able to first send a letter from one place to another and then feeling assured that it was going to get there, and now being able to make a phone call or send a text and making sure that it works. That all required international cooperation that we underwrote, that we established. And in some ways, China was a free rider in that international architecture that we established. One of the things that I discovered during my presidency is that we still underwrite it. And I'll give you a very specific example. When Ebola began to break out in Western Africa, if it had not been for the United States military essentially creating the landing strips for planes, setting up the infrastructure whereby doctors and nurses and health workers could go in and still feel confident they would be extracted if they were infected, if it was in coordination with countries like Canada and Germany and others who were willing to send in those workers and the resources to do it, we might have seen an outbreak that consumed 1 million people. China didn't do that. China sent in a plane, which we appreciated after we had done all the work. But that's true even in China's own backyard during the tsunamis and typhoons in the Philippines or in Aceh. It's our infrastructure that is helping folks. So what I've said to China repeatedly is my expectation is that as you get more wealth and power, then you cannot operate only in a self-interested way, in a mercantilist way. You also have to help carry the load. And if you are willing to carry that load in a way that's consistent with international norms and international order, then that should be welcomed.
And what do they say?
They say yes to your face, but then sometimes it's not always what they deliver. And look, they're not unique in that, and I think it's important to remember that for all the extraordinary progress that China's made, they still have the equivalent of the United States and Canada's entire population that is living in poverty, as does India. And so China in particular is constantly worried about political stability, in part because of the authoritarian nature of so many of their policies. But here's the good news. I think that when you look at the other countries in Asia, they continue to look to America for leadership. And if you look at young people in those countries, what they aspire to is what exists here in Montreal. Not just goods, not just services, not just cool stuff. They aspire to the freedom to be able to have a good idea and start a business right away. The amount of admiration for entrepreneurship and innovation that you will see in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America is extraordinary. And so young people get it. And that's how we maintain our leadership. Look, ultimately, China is 3 or 4 times larger than the United States from a population perspective. India, 2 or 3 times larger. But our leadership, our ideas, our innovation, our promotion of human rights, freedom, international law, rule of law, those are things that people still look to us to defend and to promote. And when we do so, our influence around the world is enhanced. And when we fall short, either in terms of setting our own example or in not being interested in what happens outside of our borders, then others fill the void.
Mr. President, you came out pretty strong supporting Emmanuel Macron at a critical time. What future do you see for Europe now that is the French leader?
Well, look, as a general rule, I thought things would be a little more quiet for me after I left office for at least the first year. I felt it was important for me to express my views on that particular election, given the choice that the French people confronted. And I think that President Macron has enormous potential as a vigorous young leader who has new ideas, but affirms the extraordinary results of the European Union and the European project. And I just came from Germany a couple of weeks ago, and I visited with my old friend Angela Merkel. But even before I left the presidency, I wanted to remind Europe of what they've achieved, because again, there's a tendency sometimes to take it for granted. Europe not only saw a wall come down, German reunification, peace between previously mortal enemies, but had created unprecedented prosperity for an entire continent. And that should not be thrown away lightly. Now, there have to be adjustments, I think, that are going to be difficult. The euro was an appealing idea, but in execution, obviously huge differences between the Greek economy, for example, and the German economy means that there are going to continue to be some strains in how the euro is maintained. I think post-Brexit, it is useful for Brussels and the European Union to examine how do we give voice to understandable cultural and national aspirations while maintaining the best of the European Union. Do we need to intervene in everything, or are there areas that people can still feel as if they have a voice at the local and the national levels, even as on some big issues they're unified? And those are issues that will be worked out and worked through in Europe. I think that post-Brexit there is much greater awareness both of the need for the European project not to be complacent, to listen to voices who are concerned about the disruptions that are taking place as a consequence of globalization, but also an affirmation that, you know what, this is worth saving. And I feel optimistic that people like Macron and Merkel working together, hopefully supported by a United States and a Canada and other friends that have an enormous stake in what happens on the other side of the Atlantic, that Europe comes out of this whole process stronger than it was before.
Mr. President, time flies. Time flies. 3 years ago, on that very same stage, I had the opportunity to interview Secretary Clinton in front of the same audience. And one of the themes of our discussions, especially at the end of the speech and the discussion, was about the role of women into businesses, into politics. Not because women are better, but because...
Well, they're a little better.
Well, you said it. We kind of agree. No, but joke apart, we need women in the influences of power, economical power, political power. And I have a vivid memory of when I asked her, do you believe, Madam Secretary, that you will be the first woman to utter the last glass ceiling of the highest job in the United States. We certainly felt it was possible, and so did she. That said, the audience would be mad at me if I was not going to ask you if somebody in your family may eventually be the one shattering that glass ceiling.
Well, I have some very talented nieces. But if I took a survey of Michelle, Malia, and Sasha, it probably won't be them. Now, who knows, the girls may change their mind. Michelle will not change her mind. But the larger point, I think, is very important, particularly as someone who was raised primarily by my mother and my grandparents, including a grandmother who was brilliant and worked her way up from being a secretary to a vice president of a local bank without ever having the opportunity to go to college, because it wasn't expected that a woman who had worked on the assembly lines during World War II while her husband was overseas fighting, that she too should benefit from the GI Bill and education, and so she made those sacrifices for our family. But also someone who's married to an extraordinary woman, has extraordinary daughters. This is something I'd make a couple of observations. Number one, I think people should not feel discouraged. People should not feel discouraged about the prospects of women generally based on a single that in my lifetime we will see a woman president of the United States. I don't know who that will be, but I believe that will happen just because there have been extraordinary changes just in our lifetime in terms of who's going to college, who are going to professional schools, who are starting businesses. Right? There is a whole leadership cadre, and one of the benefits of the fights on behalf of women's rights in previous generations is that my daughters take for granted they can do anything they want. They're not somehow burdened with doubt about whether if they wanted to run for the highest office of the land, or if they wanted to start a business, or if they wanted to be successful in any field, that somehow their gender would hamper them. They might complain about the fact that they still have to spend more getting their hair done, and that the dry cleaner charges them more for their clothes than men do. So I think they would recognize that sexism still exists, but they feel burdened by it, and I think that's a hopeful sign. Internationally, my mother specialized in rural development and microfinancing with a particular focus on women. And she taught me very early on, and I continue to believe, and I've seen with my own eyes, that probably the biggest determinant of how successful a country is how does it treat its women. And if it educates its women and gives women opportunity, then it's not only educating the women, but it's educating the children as well. And so although you should not expect Michelle on the campaign trail, I think you should expect Michelle working with me and others in our foundation of continuing the work that she began around girls' education around the world and girls' opportunity around the world. I will say this. I said this during my presidency repeatedly, so I think my staff can vouch for this. I did conclude at a certain point that if you just put women in charge of every country for just about 2 years, that the world would make a huge leap forward and just be better off generally, because And that's why I do think you guys are a little better. I think some of the excesses that we see in terms of conflict, in terms of war, violence, a lack of regard for children, has to do with some blind spots in those of us with the Y chromosome. We got to learn a little bit more from women in order for us to create the kind of world that we want for our children over the long term. So the more women who are running, the better. And one of the things I'm going to be doing is trying to train as many women as possible to get involved in our political life and our civic life going forward.
Mr. President, I'm sure I can translate the thought of everybody in this room in thanking you for your generosity, for your inspiration, and I would say there is a lot of a woman in you.
Wow.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, everyone.
There's definitely my mother in me, and whenever I get out of line, Michelle whips me into shape.
Please give our best regards to Michelle, and thank you again. It was an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Mr. President, Mrs. Brochu, on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, thank you for honoring us with your presence tonight. Mr. President, you are a source of inspiration for people around the world, and I'm sure that everyone here tonight learned a great deal from you and was inspired by your speech. Thank you. À vous tous. Thank you.